Hey, if nothing else, Nebraska basketball fans, I know it sucks, or they're probably thinking, we'll just handle our own work. No way we could be cheering for Creighton to make that win way back when look even better, right? It's like there is no crossover cheering for that if you're a diehard Nebraska basketball fan.
Yeah, I don't know what the rules are on that. I do think some people have had sort of it's been a very mixed feelings for the last couple months with the Husker fans and how to treat Creighton basketball. And then you throw in the Hurley component to it, and some people might have attached that and been like, you know what, I'm okay rooting for CU in this one. But I don't know that people would say that out loud. It's something they'd like whisper to like their spouse or something and not really acknowledge in public.
You heard it here first. Brian Christopherson rooting for CU. We heard it.
Well, so during that 6 game win streak, it wasn't or losing streak, it wasn't hard to think that Creighton was going to be Nebraska's best win.
No, it wasn't. And you know what? It's an interesting thing how I'm getting into a long ago talk, but when I was in college at Nebraska, up in the Schramm dorm room, it was it Terrell Taylor who hit the game winner in Chicago that one year, like in the first round of the NCAA tournament. I'm not kidding you. At that point, there wasn't this like disdain between the two sides for one another. People on the floor, I wouldn't say went crazy, but there was definitely excitement that Creighton won that game. And it was like 3 to 5 years later, it started to really shift where that did a 180. So I actually remember back at a time when I was going to school at UNL when it wasn't quite the same vibes as it is now with Creighton, Nebraska. But you're right, Damon. I think for a long time that stood as one of Nebraska's best wins. And right now, obviously, in the metrics game, you're looking for every advantage you can get. And, CU having turned it around and done well lately helps Nebraska.
Brian, I'm glad you brought that up because I agree. I remember growing up it not being as much vitriol as there is now. Like, what do you know? What happened?
Nebraska Creighton got a lot better.
Is that it? Like, just Creighton didn't feel like little brother anymore?
That's my feel. Creighton just took off.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Damon. I feel like for a while, Nebraska, I think, was winning the series, or it felt like they're at least splitting games, and then CU, won how many in a row, or it felt like they sort of were getting the lion's share of wins, and then they switched conferences, and it was no longer like, they're not in the little sandbox over here anymore. They're in a big conference too, and rubbing
elbows in work.
With that. But it is interesting how it shifted. I mean, I have maybe a different perspective on it because I grew up in Omaha, and I actually would go to Creighton games like when Bob Harstad and Chad Gallagher and DeJuan Cole and Latrell Reitzel, the Papa, were playing basketball there. So I've now of that certain age where I do have seen sort of the dynamics and how the two sides feel about each other shift pretty dramatically.
It's crazy how both guys in that backcourt are in Omaha too. That is hilarious. Like Cole and Reitzel are still here. BC. So we got Maryland, Northwestern, Penn State, Michigan. And the sports talk guy in me can give you a 4-game slate and ask predictions. How careful do we need to be, or how confident should we be to say or not say, well, let's just start with Maryland, right? Because that would be the Nebraska basketball temperament. Other programs are allowed to look at a 3 or 4 game slate. It seems like our fan base will always say, hey, just worry about Maryland. Are we still in just worry about Maryland phase?
That's a good question. I always think if you're not like actually inside the locker room and don't have to play that upcoming game, you're allowed to like look ahead. So I kind of push back on people. It's like we're not the guys doing the laundry for the team or anything. We don't have to just focus solely on Maryland. That said, I think what has served the team well is ever since Fred Hoiberg said, hey, every game is our Super Bowl after that Wisconsin loss of 6 straight. And he mentioned going into that Illinois game how they had wiped away everything off the board about Big Ten standings and all of this and that, and it was just Illinois on the board then. we haven't really asked a follow-up to that, but I have kind of wondered if that's been the approach during this winning streak. Is you have that name and everything about them right in front of you. You're not worrying about the standings. You're doing your best and not worrying about like what Joe Lunardi has you of last four in or any of that stuff. It's just like, here are the matchups. How are we going to get the better of this one? And you enjoy it for 4 hours after you win, and then you move on. And so I think they've sort of adopted that mindset, and they're going to need to carry it forward. As for those of us on the outside looking in, I always looked at the home game stretch of Ohio State, Maryland, and Michigan and said, man, if Nebraska could get two of those three and then one of the two in between on the road, boy, they'd be sitting pretty. And so the win over Ohio State left them in a good position there. I think if they can get one of these two quad one wins at home and go 500 on the road, they'd be holding steady, sort of staying one step ahead of everything.
We're talking with Brian Christopherson, Husker247. BC, this next 4-game stretch is really interesting. I'm a big Ken Pom nerd, so I always look at the projections and things like that. Every single one of these next 4 games is a 1-point margin on Ken Pom. That include those 2 potential quad one wins with Maryland and Michigan kind of bookending it. Like, if they go 2-2 in that stretch, sort of regardless, because you look at 4 coin flip games, you look at if they go 2-2 in that stretch, would you be happy kind of regardless of where the wins come?
Yeah, I think so for the most part. I mean, it would be cool if they could sprinkle in one of those that quad one wins at home. And if they did go 2-2, I would sort of assume they did some business at home. So yeah, I think that'd be a very successful for what the mission is. Now, they don't have to look at it that way, but that's interesting how you say the spreads are like 1 point. I mean, it's just in the Big Ten, it's just such a small margin for error. We see teams that, were down 1 month and then they're up the next. You really do have to have a strong mentality as a team and not get, sideswiped when you have a few bad games. And that's what I give Fred the most credit for with this team, is everybody on the outside. I remember going on the radio myself, and you're kind of leaning toward putting the dirt over this team like a few weeks ago. And, here they are, and they stayed steady in sort of what they believed in. And I think just said, hey, we have to just be a little bit more consistent at it. Now, I still think there's room for improvement there. I was talking with Schaefer about this the other day, and it feels like in a lot of these games, even during the losing streak, Nebraska would play like 30 good minutes of basketball, but there'd be about 10 minutes that were just really bad. And, that's fastball a little bit. There's runs good and bad, but I do think if you could get to like 34, 35 minutes that are really good, something like that, and kind of put that drought number down a little bit, that could be the difference in these close games you're talking about.
BC, now this is interesting because, I think 19 wins for the first time is squarely in play. So I'm not afraid to – I like how I felt like you gave me permission, Daddy BC, to kind of look ahead, because I feel like we're just afraid to do that, and other good programs do it all the time, right? Like, and I think coaches think in their head, they may not say it out loud, but they may think, man, we got to get 2 out of these next 3 or something like that. But we're so afraid to say it because they haven't had success. But quietly, Nebraska they're tied for second with most road wins in the conference with 4. Now, the 2 teams at the top, Michigan and Purdue, have 5. But Nebraska's the only team in the top 8 that's played 9 road games in the Big Ten. Everybody else has played 8 or less. So when you look at the schedule and you look at Nebraska at PBA, is the wins at home more magnified, or you feel better that you're not as desperate at home?
I mean, I always feel like there's that added pressure on every team's back when they're in their home arena to handle business. It was like a month or 2 ago, Fred. Well, I mean, Fred was talking about how they kind of keep score of it, and it's that feeling like if you go on the road.
Is that the +1, -1? Okay.
Yeah, the plus, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So I do feel like there's always that feeling like tomorrow night, like don't give a minus, like hold even in this category. That said, it is nice for them that they don't have that narrative just weighing them down like a season ago where they started 0-7 in league play. And I mean, that became a giant boulder on the back. Like it felt like heading to the final games until they finally put that away. So I think that's good, for the mentality of this team that they did kind of knock that out of the park on that West Coast trip. But I liked that the last two games, it felt to me like they were able to get that mojo back in PBA, because it was fair to wonder when they lost to USC and Rutgers, okay, has that been taken off the table for this team? Because there was that spell where it just felt like whenever they're in this arena, this team and this fan base feed off each other, where you just kind of know they're going to find a way. And I got to be honest, even on Sunday, even when they were down 5 points at halftime to Ohio State, I was like, you know what? There's been foul trouble, some of this. I think they're going to be fine in this game. I sort of had that home court belief in them. Now it's going to be interesting. How do they respond with Berke and his injury and other guys needing to step into larger roles? And I think the Berke story, could talk about that for 5 minutes, because it's just, he's one of those guys where I think at some points in the year, people would be like, big deal, he's not part of it. And then when he's actually taken away from the lineup, you realize how significant he is to all the operating parts of that team. So that's not a small thing, the fact that he's not available, especially tomorrow against this big front court from Maryland.
And all things that make you think Nebraska basketball, we're talking about a guy in Berke who can drop a dime from wing to far corner, and he's more as apt to just airmail one out of bounds, knock down a three as he is to shoot an air ball, right? So it's like, I mean, that is vintage Nebraska. Let me ask you something about numbers, BC. So we got two teams that have fives within the streaking column. Michigan has won 5 in a row. Penn State's lost 5 in a row. Nebraska's next at winning 4 in a row. Two of those 3 teams that I mentioned are on Nebraska's schedule coming up. Who continues to trend in that direction if Nebraska is going to have success over the next 4? Is it Michigan and their success, nice comeback win last night, holding court at home, or Penn State continuing to slide?
I would say that Penn State game, just because early in the year, Penn State, to me, on the road looked like a real sneaky kind of tough game.
Kim Pom still thinks it is.
Yeah, and it could be. I always think whenever you go on the road, even if a team has lost 5 or 6 in a row, I just think that it can be dangerous in this league, because everybody has the capability, as we've seen it with Nebraska, seen it with UCLA, to suddenly sort of flip a switch and get right for a few games. And so I got to be honest, Damon, I don't get as worried. Sometimes I actually look at it the other way. Like, I'll see a team that's won 4 or 5 in a row going into their game against Nebraska, and I'd be like, I think this is an okay time for Nebraska to play them, because they're not that wounded animal, that like has to have this game. Maybe I go too far with that sometimes, but I always do have sort of that, like, this team has to have it. Their backs are against the wall. Their whole season's on the line. You're going to get their best. So that's why I thought the win, honestly, at Oregon, and I know Oregon's got a lot of quad 1 wins and it's probably going to be fine, but they were
were they shaky down the stretch after handling Northwestern for the bulk of that game last night. Ooh.
Yeah, they were. And but I thought that when Nebraska played them, they were coming off that, debacle where they got hammered by UCLA, and I thought, well, that's going to be tough for the Huskers, against a team that like has to have it. So that's kind of my mindset sometimes. But Michigan playing the way they are, obviously that's going to be a tough game at PBA. That's why I say if you can get one of the Maryland or Michigan games at home, Nebraska already has 5 quad 1 wins, and by my math, there were 26 teams in the country that had that. And so, they're sitting at a good table right now. So if they can add a couple more down the stretch, it's just going to be hard for a committee to pass up on them.
Maryland is tough in the front court with guys like Queen. They got to figure out how to stay in front of Rice and Gillespie. What concerns you the most if you're Nebraska tomorrow, if you're going to hold serve at home?
It's probably Queen, Reese too to some degree, but just the way he can get after it. I think he had like 29 and 15 his last time out. And, we saw against like Illinois, Nebraska got smoked pretty good on the boards, but was able to withstand it because they kind of evened it out in the points off turnovers and some other categories. I don't know that that's as easily done again, trying to replicate that. So my biggest worry is just second chance opportunities, being able to finish off defensive possessions when you think you do have a stop and claiming the ball, because that's where I go back to Berke. He's one of their better rebounders, and Braxton Meah is going to have to give him some good minutes. Andrew Morgan's going to have to play, up another notch. And a sidebar is you're just going to have to some way kind of avoid some foul trouble with certain guys like they had last game. And I know some of that can be on the officials and how they want to whistle things, but that's going to be a big part of it. You can't have like Jawan Gary sitting for like 8 minutes in the first half tomorrow night in this game. So, I mean, that's going to be critical.
BC, I'm glad you brought up Braxton Meah, because DB and I kind of did a deep dive on him yesterday.
Now, full disclosure, it's because I was kind of being petty. This start, and Ravi did the homework. I was gonna do it, and I don't know, 10 minutes later, he like whipped out all these numbers. I was like, fudge. But I was like, hey, we got to be careful about the Meah buzz as of late. With the free throw shooting and his play because of what Ravi's getting.
Yeah, so Meah was -7 in that win, even though we were kind of okay with his minutes in general. Do you have any idea, just off the top of your head, and you probably don't, but I don't want to lead you here, do you have any idea what Braxton Meah's plus minus is against power opponents this season?
No, I didn't know he was -7. What's the whole number, though?
So for against power conference opponents this season, he's -33.
Mm-hmm.
That is, and there's been a couple games where he hasn't even played, and more importantly, he's been minus in games that they win as well. So I'm curious, if you're in Nebraska, how much do you actually want to play him versus
playing the exposure game?
Morgan?
That's a good one.
Obviously, you're going to have to use him some, right?
That's a good one.
But how do you minimize? Because it seems clear to me this is a pretty large sample size at this point for power conference opponents. He really, really struggles, and the difference between his non-power numbers versus his power numbers are dramatic. We're talking a 57-point difference in about the same number of games.
He's plus 24 in
He's plus 24 in non-power conference games, -33 in power conference games. So, how do you use him to get the minutes you need to not have to play Andrew Morgan 40 minutes or go super small ball without exposing him to a level of play that he seems to really struggle with?
That's where the foul trouble or lack of it, hopefully, situation is so important, because I'm with you on where you're going, because I feel like they're best when he's needed like he's going to be, when it's like that 8 to 10 minute range, right? Where he gives you like three or 4 minutes here, and then maybe there's that second half spot, and it's just like, give us 100 right here. Like against Creighton, when they beat CU early in the year, he came out and he honestly played 3 of the best minutes of basketball right off the bat. I still remember him going to the sideline and he was like out of breath and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that to mock him. I'm saying because he gave everything he had to those few minutes, and they were effective, and it kind of set a tone. And so that's the kind of Braxton Meah they need tomorrow night. If he gets that in there right away, it's like, I want to see him give those 3 or 4 minutes where it's just everything he has. This is why he came here, for this moment, to help this team in a spot like this. And then he goes to the bench and he's out of breath and all that, but the crowd is appreciative. So he's got to claim those boards. There's been too many times when, for a 7-footer out there, the Huskers have not controlled the glass like you'd want. And so that's going to be a big part of it with the test tomorrow, because these guys on the other side, they're physical and they find ways to win the glass. So it is a tough spot. I think this is one of the, if you had to pick a ill-timed part on the schedule to have Berke go out with an injury, I think it's going into this game on us, so that's something they're going to have to really get everybody to step up 1 or 2 notches to kind of make up for it.
As the self-proclaimed resident Maryland honk, just as the basketball junkie here, the thing that bothers me the most with this team, that I think Nebraska can match because it's not a talent thing. Maryland plays so stinking hard. Every possession, both ends of the floor, they're grimy. They get a ton of loose balls. They're really good on the offensive glass. Could I it sounds too dumbed down, but Nebraska's going to have to match Maryland's effort level more than anything that has to do with skill, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I will say, though, I think Nebraska will go into this game. There's a confidence, not that they wouldn't have it anyway playing at home, but you go back to that first game out there, I think Nebraska feels like they should have won it.
That was one of those 30 to 31 minutes of playing well game that you were talking about.
Yep. And you're tied with 1 minute left. I mean, imagine if that one were on the resume. We could play that game all day long, too, of the 4 games that were so close they lost. But that's where I think this team's done a good job of not letting those games that got away define it. And, sometimes a team can accept when you're in a skid like that, like, okay, that's the narrative of this season. We're going to be in March, and we're going to all look back at all the close ones that got away. Instead, Nebraska has so far in this stretch kind of turned that story on its head, and they're looking at tomorrow night as just another opportunity to do that. But you're right; they got to match the energy or have more of it right off the bat. That's where guys like Sammy Hoiberg are so big too, like getting on the floor for a ball or diving in the stands. Those plays when Nebraska's good at PBA, he like makes a play like that every time, and it just feeds everything. So hopefully that happens early and often, and if it does, I still think Nebraska's going to win, even if they're shorthanded.
That's BC. Brian Christopherson, Husker247. We appreciate it as always. We'll talk to you next week.
Be safe, B.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, guys.